Hello and welcome to the Health Tech Marketing Show. Today's topic is AI and marketing. Now, this is something that we've covered several times. There is so much interest in it. We're just going to keep coming back to it till people get bored of it, which I don't think is going to be for quite a while. And the other thing is that there's new stuff coming up. We're all learning about it. So today is an opportunity to hear from Casey Meehan, our resident expert in AI and marketing, about sort of what he's learning, what's new, and some practical, actionable tips. You're going to walk away with things that you can start doing immediately. Now, we also have a special guest on today, great friend of Health Launchpad, great friend of the Health Tech Marketing Show, and that is Lucy Railton, who is the VP of Marketing for the Drummond Group. Now, we brought Lucy on for a couple of reasons. First of all, they're using AI already, and she's going to talk about what she's learning and what seems, best practices that are evolving in her business. And then the other thing is that she's also representing, all of you guys who are out there listening and have questions, and sort of asking Casey questions about that will make this even more actionable. Before we go into the podcast, I do want to give a big thank you to our sponsor, Hims, who've been supporting us almost since the start of Health Launchpad. And of course, this podcast is brought to you by my firm, Health Launchpad. In case you don't know us, we're experts in health tech marketing. So with that, I'm going to bring Casey and Lucy to the stage. Hello, both of you. So anybody who, good to see you both. Casey, why don't you tell a little bit about yourself, and then Lucy, you go next.
Sure. My name is Casey Meehan. I have been a marketing agency owner for over 10 years, specializing in long form content, serving medium to large size tech companies, primarily writing long form content. In 2018, I really started getting enamored with AI and started learning Python coding and training my own neural nets. And once ChatGPT rolled out, I decided to really pivot into helping marketers and marketing teams transition into this new world of AI.
Thank you. Lucy, about yourself.
Hi, I lead the marketing team at Drummond, as you mentioned. I am a career B2B or B2 enterprise marketer, and for many tech startups and professional services firms, often with really small teams. And that's why I love this conversation about AI, because it's helping us be more efficient with a smaller team.
Always great to have you on the show, Lucy. And also, I was just realizing you're actually, for Health Launchpad, I think our first two-time client. So it's good to have you. There you go. So let's start. This episode is focused on content marketing, which is just, it's the lifeblood of B2B marketing, particularly in health tech. Casey, talk about, first of all, talk about the steps in the process. And then I think you want to start off with sort of drilling down on what's new and what are you finding works best in the initial, the upfront part, ideation and sourcing.
Sure. So I find splitting it into three parts can be pretty helpful to think about content creation in the ideation as the first stage. So really coming up with strong topics, strong angles. Then the draft phase being the second phase, drafting those. I've got some ideas on how you can make your tone and style match, what you're going for. And then the editing, breaking that out into a separate step. I think people make a lot of different mistakes trying to do all of this in one go, trying to say, hey, write a LinkedIn post about XYZ. They're not happy with it. They kind of tell it, a little bit about tone, a little bit about the details, and folks end up kind of chasing their tails. So should I drill into each of those sections a little bit more, or I'll just pause there? Adam, what's the best way to go?
I mean, let's start with ideation. So talk about ideation and where AI fits in there.
Right. So breaking that out, making sure you're starting in a good place. I think of it as sort of a range of ideation. There's the really quick and dirty method that I've outlined a few times in various places. But what I like to do is ask it to say, hey, list for me 30 trending topics in whatever area of your expertise, and it lists those. And then you can say, okay, list 30 trending topics that are top of mind for my audience, for my buyers. And then the third prompt is something like, now create novel connections between those two lists. And then that way it's starting to connect, what you do with what's on the top of mind of your buyer. So that's a pretty quick and dirty way to come up with a handful of ideas. You really want to push it to come up with some out of the box ideas. The word novel, I think, is key in that prompt. And you're not looking for all of those to be a success. You're looking for one or two good ones out of that list of 30. And typically you'll get that. And you're probably not pushing it hard enough if you're liking everything, or if everything just is like, okay. So really push it to kind of think outside of the box. Those are some terms you can use when you're connecting one to the other. So that's sort of the quick and dirty, kind of the fastest method I've seen that I've come up with for ideation. But then as marketers get more sophisticated, what they should be doing is building large knowledge bases around their brand and around all of the benefits of working with their brand and their brand mission. And they should be building large knowledge bases about their different personas, their different targets, who they are, what their pain points are, aspirations, and all that. And then they can use those two knowledge bases to create ideas and kind of synthesize ideas from one to the other, eventually maybe even having them converse with each other to generate these ideas. So that would be all the way on the more advanced side. And then there's all different shades in between, but it really comes down to, either a basic or an advanced understanding of the brand, and a basic or advanced understanding of the market, and different connection points between those two.
I have an example of ideation that I just used this morning. So it's similar. I didn't necessarily go in and say, what are the novel kind of trending topics? But I came to recognize that a lot of the content we had been developing for our cybersecurity set of services was very high level. Like, what is it? What are the basics that you need to know? So I went to ChatGPT and I asked, talking like it was a colleague, was asking it, what are topics that we should cover for this specific service that will help somebody who's closer to the bottom of their buying decision, that are going to help them decide whether to pick this vendor over another vendor. And the list that I got from that, of course, not a perfect list, but then you could do deeper dives. Let's talk more about this topic and what particular things would be included in an outline of a topic like this. Really gave me, I think, 4 or 5 pieces of content that I'll now talk to the content manager about for how do we use this? Can we use this? Can we get the subject matter expertise in the company to help with creating of this content, just to make sure that we are not always pumping out blog after blog that is high level. What is it? What do you need to know?
Yep.
Yeah.
That's great. And it reminds me of a technique that I've recently come across where you can load in, maybe it's just a screenshot of all your content. Maybe it's the blog posts of your past year or something like that, just the titles, and ask it to identify gaps. Where are the gaps in this content? And it can say, okay, these are all high level. You don't really have anything that's, medium level or bottom of the funnel type content.
One other idea put on top of that is if you've got customer research, like recent fresh customer research, using that to generate content with. So, for example, I had a series of interviews that we had done about for a particular set of buyers, and so we used that. We'd done the interviews, we turned the interviews into a research report. So then what we did was took the research report and said, help us generate some content ideas based on what the learnings from that customer research. So it's using the input. And I think that's kind of the key takeaways, is that you do have to put input in there to make it. The more information you feed in, the better the output that you're going to get. Otherwise it gets a bit general. So very, very.
Absolutely. Yeah. I've been doing a lot of market research exploration where we're pulling down all the different comments on YouTube videos or on Amazon books or Amazon products, and using that as our market research data, saying, hey, what personas do these quotes naturally divide themselves into? And, how can we use those in our topic generation, even going so far as to making sure that it's using the same language that the buyer is using in those comments can really help make it resonate.
Right. So just kind of going back up a level in terms of the process of developing content is using these AI tools to help you develop, better personas and better buyer journeys by feeding them information. Okay.
Exactly. And I think that's a critical point, because almost everyone jumps right into these tactics of let's write some social media, let's do this. But that's just the tip of the iceberg. Underneath there is, foundational knowledge of, well, like I said, your brand and your different buyers and your strategies. So, those should be ideally, if you're thinking long-term about how to use AI, really focusing on building those knowledge bases, building custom GPTs that can speak, as your brand and can reference that knowledge base. Similarly, your customers, and then, building that into a strategy, which is a lot of the ideation part, and then getting to the tactics where you're actually drafting and creating these pieces. So those are foundational.
Anything before we move on to actually to the next step, which is creating the content, anything about source material and getting information, insights, data to inform what you're about to create?
I think just be creative with it. I'm talking to people that are pulling in all sorts of Gartner research, and they're just pulling in all different types of source material in addition to, the things that we've spoken about. Interviews with subject matter experts, organizing those neatly and kind of keeping all of this stuff tidy and having a lot of it that you can experiment with can go a long way. Because I think of these as reasoning machines. I think a lot of folks come to them thinking of them as search engines, which they're not great at. And they're getting better, but they're not really great at that. Sam Altman described it as a reasoning engine more than anything. So if you're supplying it with accurate stuff and saying, hey, use this to synthesize something, whether that's a content plan or a post or whatever, then you're really capitalizing on the best parts of these, which is to actually reason and synthesize rather than to hunt down data, which it may or may not get correct.
But if you do use it to hunt down data, like if you are a small marketing team and you don't have thousands of dollars to buy a Gartner report and nobody's gifted it to you, there is some, database nature to ChatGPT. I always ask, if I'm doing that high level research, to make sure it lists the source of information at the bottom so that I can then go to Google and find the actual source. Because often when it provides the URLs, they don't work. They're not functioning.
Yeah, right.
If I have the title and who published it, then I can go and get additional information to make myself and the writer kind of more informed about the topic.
Yeah, absolutely. That brings credibility to the article as well.
And I have a lot of ideas about that's more, for me, I put that more in the editing, kind of the third phase. And we can talk about that now, or we can
let's move on to talk about drafting. Okay, so you've got your topics. Okay, now what? What do you do, Casey?
I think the biggest thing is creating some style examples. So if you tell it to write like XYZ person, it's going to create kind of a caricature of that person. It's not really going to do very well. Like if you say write like Seth Godin, it's going to just bring up all these weird, like comparing everything to a purple cow, which is one of his books. And that's really not what you mean when you say write like Seth Godin. Don't insert purple cow every 3 lines. But if you take a Seth Godin blog post and you pull that into a Google Doc and you download that and say, this is a style example, please draft it based on this example. And maybe you want to put 3 examples in there that are all closely related. Maybe they're all from Seth Godin, or ideally they're all from you eventually. But to get started, you might pick somebody who you want to emulate and say, hey, write a blog post or write a LinkedIn post that is in the style of the attached style examples. That, I think, is a much better way of explaining its style than saying, oh, it's formal, it's informal, it's this or that. When you think about it, these large language models, they have so much in their training data that every word is like bringing up all this stuff in there. When you actually, if you just show it, hey, here's what I'm going for, that is a faster way to getting to the correct style. And again, once you've worked through a handful, or maybe you take your best performing blog posts or your best performing LinkedIn posts and use those as a starting place as your style examples, and then keep updating them when you have new winners. in there. So that's my go-to idea for the first draft. Typically, it'll be pretty off base when it generates that first draft. And now we're getting a little bit into the editing, but I think this is still in the draft phase. You can say, okay, well, typically it'll bring up, maybe it's not where you were going, not what was top of mind when you saw that topic. You can just say, well, my take on this is X, Y, Z. Maybe even give it the first sentence saying, here is the angle that I want to go. Please rewrite this whole thing from that angle, starting with this sentence potentially. And then you're getting much closer to a decent first draft. And then we're getting into the editing phase, which we'll hold off on. But I'll pause there, I guess.
I like I'm not sure I've done content, or our content manager has done content where we write a blog and then we have a rewrite. I've applied a gender to ChatGPT. We've had it rewrite that blog. I know when I'm doing paragraphs or smaller chunks of content, if I'm trying to do ad copy or if I'm trying to do social post copy, I will redo the copy while in. I like this message, but I want the intent to be the following, please rewrite. I haven't done that yet for larger piece of content, because typically what happens is we pull out what we have and we manually will copy edit it 2 or 3 times. It'll see several sets of eyeballs at the company before we deem it final. So I haven't done that. We should try that.
I'll share my own sort of use of it. And I know we're going to get more into tools a bit later on, but I use Claude, and I've found that that's the best for writing so far. What I will do is, and I'm going to do this with this podcast. So it's after getting this podcast, I will create a transcription using Descript, and then I will take the transcript over to Claude and I will give it a set of instructions. So the first instructions are, what are the 5 to 10 topics that were discussed in this podcast. So I can go through and do that. I'll then say, okay, give me ideas for titles, and give me ideas for titles. I'll then say, write me a 2,500 word article using this particular title and the 10 topics and the style and in my sort of typical style. And it'll then create the first draft. I found that the first draft is getting better and better and requires less editing. And the reason why is that it's learning. And I am, and I put it, Casey's helped me about this, is that I've done a lot to train it. I fed in 20, 30 articles into it to say, this is, kind of the stuff that we've written historically. And then I will keep doing things like, Lucy, you shared your giveaway words. I want you to talk about. I fed that in the other day saying, please avoid using these words as much as possible. And I also there were some other writing style things. And it just said, and I asked it the other day, said, are you learning? And I asked it, and it said, yeah, and it went through all of the different ways that it's developing a style based on the information I put in. It's mind blowing. And it is, I feel like every time I still edit the draft quite a lot, but it's not, whereas I might have spent an hour or so editing, I might now only spend 20 to 30 minutes editing.
I think that'll be a great topic for your next podcast on AI, is how to teach your tool.
Yes.
So
yeah.
We're using ChatGPT currently and we just set up a corporate account. So I don't know if I train mine, will, those learnings transfer over to the other account, which is tied to the corporate account. I assume not. We were using Jasper. I just prefer ChatGPT. So we moved away from that. So it'd be interesting.
Yep.
Topic for future consideration is, how do you train that tool, right? So I don't necessarily want to train it for the rest of the world. Right. So I haven't necessarily said, yes, you can share my chat history and teach the rest of the world, but I would like to train it for me, for sure. Just as if I treat it like a colleague. I have a question. What's this word I'm forgetting? It means the following. I would have asked that as a colleague before. In fact, I recently did have that word. I completely blanked on the word paraphrase. And I was like, what does it mean when you take a quote and you modify it to make it more easy to understand? And we could not, for the life of us, the two of us, remember the name. I went to my colleague ChatGPT, and of course, they gave me the word. Like, of course,
brilliant. That's a brilliant use. I have that all the time.
Yeah. So yeah, that would be great. next step for us is to learn how to train it, because I have not done a really great job at educating our tool on what our style is for writing. We definitely have lots documented externally. I don't feel like I know how to train my tool to take that document and learn from it for my use as opposed to the world's use. Yeah.
Casey, any perspectives on that?
Well, it's interesting what you've described, that I believe you're saying that Claude, every time you're logging in, you're opening it up, a fresh chat, and it's remembering what you've gone through with it in previous chats. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Because that, to me, I don't believe it's supposed to really be doing that. I don't think all of them are. They may be doing it behind the scenes and not telling folks about it, but that's really, multiple people have brought this up, and I've looked into it a little bit, and that is, that's interesting, very interesting to me. There are much more formal ways to train it, specifically in ChatGPT's custom GPTs, where you're loading in your style examples, you're loading in, hey, don't use any of these words. You're clearly articulating to it how you want it to behave. ChatGPT is still the best for that, for pulling in the different tools and different, use cases like that. But that it's actually just behind the scenes, kind of getting a feel for who you are, is very interesting. And I can't say that I've experienced it the same way, but I'm not really I'm really beating the heck out of these things. So I'm doing all sorts of weird stuff with them all day long. I'm not following that same process. So I wouldn't be surprised if it's probably the wrong way to try to train it.
I will go back and double check what I just said, but that is the case. But I will tell you, I did an experiment where I took the same prompts that I just described there and the same transcript. So basically everything was sort of, the inputs were all equal. And I used ChatGPT, I used Gemini, I used Claude, and one of my colleagues used Jasper. Claude for me was what the output was usable, didn't need much editing. ChatGPT was very bullet pointy and really just not usable. And again, I hadn't trained it, so it hadn't had this style input. Jasper, for some reason, my colleagues said they just couldn't handle I guess that it has a different interface, so it just didn't work with it. And Gemini didn't seem to get it.
Interesting.
It was really, it was. So we should, and I'll share the output. I've got no stake in Claude, but I've become a fan of that. Okay, let's move on to editing. So Casey, what's the deal with editing?
Well, I think as you touched on the different tools, and it's kind of related to editing, but I think as far as writing goes, Claude really is, I think, the winner in a lot of ways. And there's a lot of different reasons for that. It has a fairly large context window, and it's believed that it's been trained on essays more than some of the other models. And I think it performs especially well when you're putting a lot of information into it. I've done a lot of these head-to-head competitions with the three of them. And when I'm loading in a whole transcript and saying, hey, what about this and that, and interacting with that transcript, Claude performs the best. Gemini, I think, is probably my go-to starting place. If I wanted to generate ideas, I would probably start with Gemini. I think it actually has just kind of seems to think better. And it's, both tools I think are better than ChatGPT most of the time. As you said, ChatGPT is very bullet pointy and will often give you an intro paragraph and an ending paragraph that are basically unnecessary.
Redundant.
Yeah, where Gemini will put in, especially in the conclusion paragraph, some things that you didn't really think about, where it's like, oh, maybe think of it not necessarily in your prompt, but pushing you into different ideas related to that. So instead of that redundant information, you're getting, extra information there. So ideation, I would use Gemini for the most part. They're all good. You know what I mean? You can get by. If for some reason your organization only supports one, don't feel like you're really missing out, because you can really do some good stuff with all of them. ChatGPT, I think, is best just for its usage of these custom GPTs. So being able to load in information and consistently being able to access that easily, that's what's putting it pretty far ahead. And then Claude again for the writing. So
So you, I think you mentioned to me one time about 7 types of editing.
Yeah, so that's what I want to get into next. So let's say you've got a draft that's feeling okay. Then folks often say, I like this, I don't like that. And they're not really being clear of, like, are you talking about line editing? Are you talking about proofreading? Or are you talking about structural editing? So there's different ways to edit. And you want to kind of go in priority of like the biggest edits down to the smallest edits, and being very precise with these large language models as far as what you're asking for them to return. And when you're close, when you've got something that you really like, I've started to use the words verbatim a lot. So change this, keep the rest intact verbatim, because you don't want it to just keep rewriting and you lose stuff, and then you have to kind of manually Frankenstein it all together. So say you've got a draft that you're feeling pretty good about. You want to start at that high level. Maybe just play the role of a critical editor and really critique this from, what is my audience going to take away from this? What would a harsh critic, a harsh buyer kind of say about this? And just get feedback on a high level of like, is anybody really going to care? Maybe I love this idea, but nobody really cares. So then moving into more structural editing. So is there better ways? Is there a better order I can deliver this information? And maybe like that last paragraph should be first, don't bury the lead, that type of thing. Yeah. So then going through the structure of it, and then getting narrower and narrower of like, how can I word this sentence better? One I really like is, I would never use these words like breakthrough or groundbreaking. It uses all these like really fancy, salesy words. You can say, I would never use words like this, and this. Please, rewrite this based on that. I find that works better than saying make the tone less salesy, because that can just mean so many different things. So really being precise with it in order of the editing, kind of the big picture editing down into the very bottom proofreading. So even if, almost everything you have to manually edit to some degree, I'll still push that back through and say, hey, are there any errors in here? And it'll just look for any grammatical errors. It'll spot maybe a place where there's 2 spaces or something like that. So that's, being precise about what you're asking it versus just being, saying, do this or do that. And it kind of keeps rewriting. It doesn't really know, how to respond. And it doesn't do a great job if you don't give it good direction.
I think that's a learning for our team, is how to do the editing in the tool, because right now we're doing the editing manually outside of the tool and manually looking for what we have right now is a list of over 30 words that we find are used often, or phrases that are used often, and trying to take them out. But we're gonna try doing it in the tool, through further instruction to get a better first draft before.
Yeah. I think you can continue. It'll never be perfect. I think there's always a little bit of manual, that last 5% is just easier to fix yourself. But I think a year ago, it was like, I could get it to be about 70% there. And now I think it's closer to like 95% of the way there. And I really like leaning on the tool to do it, because I know that it's probably not adding like weird little grammar errors that I'm always going to miss. So that's one incentive to try to keep it, doing a lot of that work.
Lucy, you shared something last week in the Health Tech Marketing Network, which is, the network for health tech marketing leaders, which I found incredibly useful. Talk a little bit about that, because that's a great input for editing.
I started to notice some kind of reoccurring habits and styles coming out of the content we were writing. I mean, the first couple things I noticed were really long titles with a colon in between. So all of the titles being suggested were much longer than I would have normally preferred, and they were broken up by a colon. Always a colon, never an M dash or a comma, always a colon. And I noticed that in Jasper, and I noticed that also in ChatGPT.
And Claude does it too. Yep.
Yeah. And I started noticing first was that in a world, in an environment, in a realm, in a landscape where, and I like good storytelling, but it felt really contrived. So
sounds like the movie trailers. In a world where health tech marketers are struggling to handle AI and content marketing.
And it was very prevalent. So, okay, what other words are kind of recurrently used? So I've done some research. I've gone to, Reddit to find other words. Oh yeah. So a couple of the other ones I think were like tapestry was used a lot. Bolstering, one that I noticed recently that we got, if I can remember, is imperative. It's not just important, it's an imperative. So we just kind of started keeping that list. And right now we're manually reviewing it. I've tried to prompt the tool before starting write, please avoid these words. I think it's too much prompting. So I'm going to try and move that to an editing phase and see if we can't do that. There's also, some forwarding things like lots of like transitions that were unnecessary and key point redundancies. Like you said, Casey, they would summarize the key point in an introductory paragraph, give me some bulleted lists or some paragraphs that aren't bulleted, but could be bulleted lists, and then recap it in a summary paragraph and then on to the next section, which also recapped it. So trying to teach ourselves to kind of look for that. It's the exact same key messages, just reworded in another way. Sometimes those sentences would be back to back. So the same key point worded two different ways. And it's like, okay, I don't need that. That's not adding any value here. So there's just we have this running list of things to look for when we're reviewing that content and editing it.
ChatGPT is especially bad at all those things. The other, Claude for sure, and Gemini is much better at that. And I often wonder if it's because ChatGPT they were the first ones out and they got under a lot of scrutiny. So they had to put up all these barriers and guardrails. And there's a lot of people who had been using it a lot and saw it almost get dumber over time because of all these different, legal issues that they were facing. So I think that's kind of almost hurt them to be the first ones to market in some ways, but I don't know. They're not hurting too bad, obviously. One last thought on the editing, kind of getting back to what we were speaking about earlier of finding more information. This is something we probably talked about this on an earlier podcast, Adam, but I think it might be worth repeating that once you have a draft pretty good, maybe you're not at the line editing level, but you're through most of the copy editing. I like to ask it, what information, what data would really strengthen this blog post or this LinkedIn article? And it'll say, it'd be great if we had stats on this, on that, on X, Y, Z. I will take that exact response and put that into Perplexity AI, which is the number one tool that I use for searching the web, and say, Perplexity, can you go out and find this data? And it'll say, I found this and this, I couldn't find this and this. And then it supplies all the citations, like you mentioned. So I just take that response and bring it back into whatever tool I'm using to do the writing and say, please update the draft. And citing these sources, please include these full URLs in your response. And in that way, you're peppering it with better data. You can do that to fact check as well. If there's a bunch of kind of information in there that you don't want to Google it, every single one, and not sure where they got that, you can take the whole draft, pull that into Perplexity and say, hey, please fact check all of this data and provide source material. And then you can work between the two of them to just make sure that any sort of information has been cited with a link. Can not only save you from the potential hallucinations, but it does strengthen, I think, the piece quite a bit by having those citations. You can then even reach out to the people that you cited and just mention, hey, by the way, we mentioned you here, and maybe get a little bit of boost in your outreach that way.
Very interesting. This is, everything that you guys have been saying is so actionable. And if you're listening to this, what I'm going to do with this, as I really do with every episode, is I'm going to take the transcripts and turn this into a very actionable blog post. So, you can, after listening to this, you should be able to read the rest of the post and actually, translate this into things that you can start doing today. Any closing thoughts, Lucy, then Casey?
Well, I'll just mention how we've used it recently, because I think a lot of people have been talking about, developing that content, researching the content, editing the content. We used it recently to create audio for a video, and ChatGPT specifically. They have 4 amazing voices, do not sound robotic, maybe in certain spots. But, we loaded our script and we said, please check for grammar, because it won't read what you load. But if you have it rewrite it and fix the grammar, then you have the little speaker icon where you can listen to it. So we have, an employee meeting next week, and we have a kind of a raw video, and the voiceover is thanks to ChatGPT. So great tool for time or cash strapped marketing teams.
Fantastic. Yeah. That's really cool. I never thought of it just using that as the voiceover, because there's these other tools, 11 Labs, that's really good at that. But it is, the voice is fantastic. That's awesome. I love it. I've got one for you, Adam. One kind of closing thing to think about is I've been exploring, extreme long form content. So I just released a video on my YouTube channel.
All those called books.
What's that? Exactly.
Books.
Yeah, I just released a video called How to Write a Book with AI, and it's on my YouTube channel as Blazing Zebra. But the basic gist of it is you can take a long, intensive outline. So you could take maybe a very important, if it's a client meeting or a very important webinar, podcast, or whatever, and bring that into Claude and say, please create a detailed outline of this. So it's the first response is not a summary, but a detailed outline. And then the next prompt, you can say, please, create a detailed summary of that first section. And then you just say, please continue with section 2, section 3, section 4. And in that way, you're able to get, 3,000, 4,000, 5,000 words, like a very robust document from your transcript or whatever that initial source material is. And this is how you can then think about those being potentially chapters in your book that are, 3,000 to 5,000 words that are much longer than the average response, which is somewhere in that 500 range, because it can hold all of that in its memory. Especially Claude is very good at holding a ton of stuff in its memory. But the limiting factor is the response length, where it's only oftentimes 500 to 800 words. But if you break it into an outline again, and then ask it to just work through that outline, you can then get much longer pieces of content. This can be great for lead magnets, ebooks, anything like that.
We did that with a checklist. So we had a high-level checklist that was written a while ago for HIPAA specifically, and I wanted to provide more value to the readers. So we went through each item and said, what is best practice to do the following? What is some information that people may not understand is, required for this checklist item? And we definitely 5 times the length of that piece of content.
Awesome.
Yeah.
And then you can load it back in. You pull all that into a document. You load that back into Claude and say, give me ideas for smoother transitions between these sections. Yeah. Or give me ideas for how is a better way to structure this. Maybe there's 2 sections that are very similar. They could be combined or they should be next to each other, and get it to kind of tell you how to manually kind of rearrange it.
Well, Lucy and Casey, I knew that getting 2 of you together would create a great discussion. And let me tell you, as you know, I'm very passionate about the use of this. I'm having so much fun playing around with it. And so I would consider myself to be, I don't know about an advanced user, but at least an advanced intermediate user. And I have learned a ton today. And
Me
so
too.
Yeah, good. Excellent. So with that, I want to thank you both for taking the time today. This has been incredibly helpful. And then for those of you who are listening to this, you can watch the video. Also, there'll be a blog post on healthlaunchpad.com. And if you're watching the video or you're reading the article and you want to subscribe, you can subscribe to the Health Tech Marketing Show on any of your favorite podcast applications. So with that, I want to give a big thank you to Lucy and Casey. And
thank you, Adam.
Yeah, thank you.
Wonderful to have you on the show, and we'll bring it to a close. So farewell, everybody.